After being defeated by Henry VII at the Battle of Stoke Field in 1487, Francis Lord Lovell was last seen crossing the nearby River Trent, escaping from the battlefield. Richard III had died 2 years earlier at Bosworth, but his loyal courtier Lovell had joined forces with the Earl of Lincoln and other Yorkist rebels to try and gain control back from Henry, the new king. They battled for 3 hours on the morning of the 16th of June, 1487. But Henry VII triumphed. Francis Lovell found himself on the losing side of what was to be the last battle in the Wars of the Roses. He was in extreme danger. Legend has it that he escaped that night to his manor house in Minster Lovell. Fearing for his life, he hid himself in a secret chamber and told his servant to swear never to tell anyone of his whereabouts. In 1708, builders exposed a hidden room in the ruins of Minster Lovell Manor and opened the door. There, sitting at a table, was a body which crumbled to dust when exposed to the air. Was it Francis Lovell, or is this just a myth? The village name comes from 2 historical periods. Minster is probably from an Anglo-Saxon minster on the site of the present-day church, and Lovell was added to recognize the medieval Lovell family. The village has a rich history, stretching from early Neolithic times right through to the modern day. Artifacts discovered around the village pinpoint settlements at different periods in history. Stone tools and arrowheads were found in fields on high ground around the village by Tony Broome and other archaeologists. The parish's northern boundary is formed by the Roman Ackerman Street, and there were many small villas in the area, so it is not surprising that the ground has revealed Roman coins, tiles, and brooches. Saxon graves have also been excavated, producing jewellery as well as human and dog bones. And a rare jewel from about AD 875, much like one belonging to Alfred the Great, was discovered close to the River Windrush. Both the Minster and Alfred jewels are on display at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. But the village was at its heyday in medieval times. Both Old Minster Lovell and nearby Little Minster were mentioned in the Domesday Book of 1086, and a bridge over the river existed in 1197. The current bridge has been updated over the intervening 800 years, but it is essentially the same crossing which would have been used by John and Maud Lovell, the great-great-grandparents of the hapless Francis. There were mills in both Little Minster and Old Minster in the 12th century for grinding corn and fulling cloth. The cloth was stretched out to dry in the fields. Eventually, the wool manufacturing industry moved away from the village, and by 1851, there were only corn mills at the 2 locations. Generations of families have been millers, including those by the name of Harris, Hudson, and Cooper, until the main mill closed in 1924. Across the road from the mill is the Old Swan Inn, which is one of the oldest buildings in the village, sitting at a strategic point just over the bridge.
Please, Your Grace, let me send a message.
King Richard III no doubt enjoyed ale and food here with his retinue when he visited his Chancellor, Francis Lovell. Richard's crest of a white boar would have been prominent everywhere he travelled, but the political Yorkist symbol of a rising sun was painted on the wall of a bedroom in the Swan and still exists today. The Lovell family themselves would have been excellent hosts, whether home at the hall or dining out at the inn, keen to impress those in power. They needed to protect their own future in turbulent times. More recently, the Swan has been the resting place of varied travellers from sheep drovers, World War II refugees, actors, royalty and politicians, as well as tourists. The Lovell family owned land in the village from the 12th century, but it is not until about 1430 that William Lovell built Minster Lovell Hall. Archaeology shows that there was a good-sized building and a farm complex in the area before the hall was constructed, so William probably reused and rebuilt over old buildings. Places where the walls don't quite match can be seen on the site near the stables. The main rooms of the hall formed a U-shape, with the open side facing the river Windrush, consisting of a single buttress wall. A cobbled path led to an entranceway opening out into the large hall, which had a solar above it. The site included a bedroom wing, a chapel, kitchens and stables. Some of the rooms were heated by large fireplaces, and there were stained glass windows. William did not live long in the house, as he died in 1455, so it was quite an impressive building. And it remained in the family only as long as his grandson, Francis. Not surprisingly, Henry VII confiscated the lands of the Lovells after the Wars of the Roses, and that ended their association with the village. From the remains on the site, it is easy to imagine a thriving community of people living here in the Middle Ages, supporting the lord of the manor. The river Windrush, along with specially built holding ponds, supplied fish. Fertile fields were cultivated for grain, and hops grown for beer. And there was plenty of riverside grazing land, with shelter for livestock. The dovecote, still standing on Manor Farm, held 600 nest holes arranged in 18 tiers to provide birds and eggs for food. Providing you had permission to hunt, or even if you didn't, Wychwood Forest stretched right into the village and was full of game to eat and wood for fires. Spiritual needs were also fulfilled nearby. Stones from the 12th century chapel of St. Cecilia can be seen incorporated into the wall of Manor Farm. The current church was built by William Lovell in about 1450. He dedicated it to St. Kenelm, an 8th century Mercian prince, the patron saint of 7 churches from Worcester to Winchcombe. The alabaster tomb in the south transept is purported to be that of William, who died shortly after the building's completion. The church today appears almost as when William built it, and has some unusual features that reflect both the past history of the site and the ideas of its builder. Its atypical cruciform shape may have been influenced by the foundations of earlier churches, and the internal arches and stone pillars supporting the tower suggest an adapted design. The Diocese of Lincoln and key patrons are commemorated in the carved heads on the corbels of the arches. Marmaduke Lumley, Bishop of Lincoln, Lord and Lady Lovell, and Henry VI. The font, and unusually the seating, date from William's time. Medieval congregations would normally sit on the floor. There are even squints, holes from which the lepers could view the chancel away from the congregation.
Not just on your own backyard.
Unfortunately, most of the stained glass is now missing, but the windows do contain fragments of medieval glass. After deteriorating over the centuries, the church was restored in the 1860s, and St. Kenelm now reflects many centuries of worship. More humble villagers are also commemorated here. In the churchyard are the graves of George Hudson, a miller in the early 19th century, and his contemporary, Decimus Clemens, landlord of the White Hart pub. By the time she had given birth for the 10th time, his mother had obviously run out of names. Although it is not possible to tell from the gravestones, the population of the village dropped dramatically in the 14th century due to the plague, and it took 500 years for it to recover and then start growing again significantly. Even in more modern times, life was hard, with many village children dying in the Union workhouse in the 1840s and 50s. In 1897 and 1902-3, there were 2 diphtheria epidemics when the Holloway, Brackley, Hall, Godfrey, Locke and Norwich families lost 15 members in the space of a few weeks. Most of the existing houses in Old Minster Lovell were built in the 17th and 18th centuries. The oldest ones, such as Deep Thatch and Tulloch's House, still have their steep thatched roofs. Stone is not far from the surface here, and the village had its own quarries. But some houses were built from the remains of Minster Lovell Hall, which was largely dismantled and sold by the Coke family in 1747. The Cokes were absentee landlords for more than 200 years and took the opportunity to make a profit from the old buildings, recycling the stone. Probably not for the first time. Some cottagers were very inventive in finding building material. Over the door of Lovell Cottage on the main street, there is a partial gravestone. On the hill above the old village is what was, for many centuries, the main road. The road was turnpiked in 1751, and a toll was charged to travel along it. The old toll house was demolished in July 1956. But the White Hart pub, built around the same time as the turnpike, is still a thriving business on what is now a busy modern road between Burford and Witney. However, it is not difficult to imagine the notorious local highwaymen, the Dunstan brothers, galloping away from the White Hart, escaping from another stagecoach robbery. They apparently shod their horses backwards to try and confuse those who chased them, but given their reputation, it probably didn't work too well. The area south of the main Burford to Witney Road, variously called the Upper Village, Newminster or Charterville, saw its greatest change from the 18th to the 20th centuries. There was little here until 1847, when Chartist Fergus O'Connor bought 244 acres, mainly along the current Bryce Norton Road, and divided it into 80 plots. Following a career of lobbying for economic and electoral reform, O'Connor developed his Chartist land plan, where subscribers could draw lots to win property. His utopian aim was to move poor city dwellers to the country, where they could become self-sufficient. It is from this time that nonconformist religion took off in the village, starting with the Wesleyans and Baptists, moving to the primitive Methodists, and continuing to this day with the thriving modern Methodist congregation. Each Charterville plot had 2 to 4 acres of land, and a small cottage with a standard layout. There was enough room for a family and the farm animals to live. Charles and Elizabeth Nippard and their 5 children came from inner-city London. Charles was a painter by trade. John Bowyer was a coal miner from Northumberland and had 6 children. Neither of these families looked suited to life as farmers in Minster Lovell. The land was simply too poor and small for large Victorian families, and the people too inexperienced at farming. By 1852, most of the original settlers had left, including the Bowyers and the Nippards, who both went back to their hometowns at opposite ends of Britain. For a while, many of the cottages stood empty. Much of the land was then bought by people from the Vale of Evesham, who planted strawberries and fruit trees, which thrived on the rough ground. Joseph Price and William House were typical settlers from Pershore in Worcestershire, but even they struggled after a time. And local people such as the Busby, Norwich, Moby and Holloway families began to buy up the plots, converting some into smaller allotments. Minster Lovell became a village farmed by local people once again. Most of the original Charterville bungalows have been extended and altered, so the standard 19th century building now appears in a variety of forms. When the Chartist development was built, a school was added on Upper Crescent to replace the home schools that had existed before. For some reason, the strong-minded villagers took a dislike to it, and the school soon moved to the large Victorian building on School Hill. Villagers remembered a very strict headmaster, but high-quality teaching in the early 20th century. In 1968, as numbers shrank, the school moved to its present site on Wenrisk Drive, where new generations of Minster Lovell children still gain an excellent education, as well as having time to let off steam. As the 20th century progressed, the Spa shop was built, run by the Lewis family. And another row of shops further up the road was erected in the 1970s. The post office, butchers and bakery, which had been in the old village, were now at the top of the hill, and other small businesses began to join them. Near the White Hart was the Toll House Cafe, a popular place in the 1950s, with a typical tea room for travellers in the front, but the sound of Elvis Presley and Cliff Richard blaring out from the back room where the youth of the village congregated. The cafe no longer exists, but St Kenelm's Hall across the road is now used for many village functions. Down in the old village, the changes were a little more subtle. From the 17th to 19th centuries, there were a handful of large farms, usually managed by tenants, as well as small parcels of land owned by individuals. The Halin and Peacock families farmed Little Minster. John Wheeler leased the main manor from the Cokes in 1711. The property was later passed on to the Tauntons and was farmed by John Gillett, a sheep breeder of renown. Other large families in the village included the Walkers, Collis, Hale, Dean, Batts, Dutton, and Dix families. Agriculture was the main economy, and employment in the village increased in 1857, when the Abraham family created Ringwood Farm, cleared from a large area of Witchwood Forest. There were other trades too. Several Minster generations worked in the blanket industry. Firstly at the Minster Lovell mill, but eventually employment centred around the large factories in Witney, where mass production for a worldwide market could take place. Home working still existed right into the 20th century. As was common in West Oxfordshire, some women in the village produced expensive gloves for society ladies. Locke's Cottage, now called the Old Post House, had originally been a carpentry shop from the early 19th century, where everything from cartwheels to coffins were made. It also served as the village post office from 1853 to 1938, when it became a home. The Old Bakehouse was a village shop and bakery run by the Hudson and Blake families. It was easier to keep the oven fires going all the time, so although there was no baking on Sunday, the villagers brought their meat to be roasted there, right up into the early 20th century. The River Windrush, which through the centuries had provided power, transport, washing facilities, and been an essential source of fish and crayfish for many villagers, gradually became a place of leisure. The crayfish pots have long since vanished from hooks outside the cottages along the main street, as has the strong smell. Albert Greengrow, who came from Kent each year to collect reeds from the river for thatching and lining barrels, stopped coming. The house, now called Summer Meadows, was once named Greengrow after him. The Ambrose family bought the mill buildings in the 1930s. Decades later, Dr. Ambrose planned to convert the buildings into a medical research centre, but he ran out of money and eventually the mill became a business conference venue. Minster Lovell, while still trying to preserve the best of its Cotswold heritage, continues to grow and change. The historic cottages have been merged into bigger homes with fewer inhabitants than in previous times. The War Memorial, for many years hidden on a back road, has been moved to a prominent place at the Turnpike crossroads. The village has a wonderful pavilion on Wash Meadow, from which cricket can be watched on a glorious summer's day. The thriving cricket club is over 100 years old, and there is also an active football team. Sport is important here. The village looks at its best in the spring and summer, when the gardens are in full bloom, and both neighbours and tourists stop to chat and admire the flowers. Minster Lovell has adapted to the 21st century, but with a little imagination, it is not difficult to visualise the ancient Britons, Romans, medieval peasants, noblemen of the Lovell family, farmers, rich and poor, and many ghosts of those who inhabited this village in the past.